Hello, everyone. I welcome you all to this Shivalik series seminar. Our today's speaker is Catherin Badgley from the University of Michigan. She will be talking on the From Fossils to Ecosystem in Shivalik Record of Pakistan. For those who are new to this series, there were talks delivered earlier by Professor Bob Reynolds, John Gary, John Barry, and Abdul Qayyum. And if someone is interested, they can retrieve these talks from the link I must have provided already. So over to Professor Bob for introducing the speaker and starting tonight's program. Bob.
Yeah, thank you very much, Irfan, and thank you also to Mukhtiar and to the Geological Survey of Pakistan, who are really providing the technical support behind the scenes. And we are running this seminar once a week. It's going to be this same time for the next 10 to 14 weeks, from what I can tell, going forward. We've got Humad Ghani coming up next week, followed by Doug Burbank, followed by Muhammad Akbar Khan from Lahore. And then we've got several people scheduled also in April. So we invite yourselves, if there is anybody who wants to participate as a speaker in the seminar series, we can always fit them in May, probably. So this is a little bit of an open-ended exercise, but we have people coming, joining us from India. We've got a couple people coming from India. So we'll have a variety of presentations and topics dealing with the Siwaliks. And it's my huge pleasure this evening to introduce Catherin Badgley, who's a professor at the University of Michigan. And I first met Catherin in Pakistan back in the 1979-ish, I think. And she was working in the area around the Patwar, around Khor, and the Camellia area of on the Salt Range region. And Catherin did her research there, starting initially with the Yale-Harvard Geological Survey team that John Barry spoke about. And she has subsequently carried that research forward and now works on a worldwide basis looking at environmental science, and she teaches classes involving food systems and environment, and she's deeply interested in climate and the climate impact on biodiversity. And we welcome Catherin to the stage. So looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Bob. And salam alaikum to all my friends in Pakistan. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm very pleased that this series is occurring. Now, I am going to wait for Mukhtiar to load my presentation, and then I'll get underway. He's very kindly helping me out because I'm having some, let's see, Mukhtiar, if you could use my original, that would be helpful.
Okay.
That's it. We just need to go back to the beginning. There we go. Great. Wonderful. So the title of my talk today is From Fossils to Ecosystems in the Siwalik Record of Pakistan. And I'd like to first tell you a little bit about my background. So if I could have the next slide, please. The next slide has a photograph that Bob Reynolds took back in 1979, and it shows myself and Tay Berensmeyer working in the Dokpatan Formation near the town of Khor. And I wanted to let you know that I first began to work in the Siwalik Record as a graduate student when I was a doctoral student at Yale, and I worked from 1975 to 1982 doing my dissertation research. And some of that research I'll talk about today. And then after I graduated, I moved to the University of Michigan, and from there I continued to work on the Siwalik Record, going to the field back to the Patwar Plateau almost every year between 1982 and 1996. And that 1996 for me was my last field season. Although the project that we were working with continued to travel to Pakistan for several years longer. And then from 1996 to now, I, along with my colleagues, have continued to work on this record. And one of the things I'll try to do in my talk is try to convey how extraordinary this record is. And the topics that I've worked on are listed here. One of them is the taxonomy of fossil localities. And taxonomy refers to the ways in which biological material, organic material is preserved in the fossil record. So essentially it's the study of the processes of preservation, starting with living organisms and ending up with fossils eroding out of a modern landscape. And then I've also worked on sedimentary environments of the Siwalik sediments, the paleo ecology, the paleo environments of the fluvial system, and also of the mammals that live there. And then more recently, I've worked on ecosystem changes over time. And now especially I'm working on what is called evolutionary dynamics, which refers to the coming and going of species, the appearance and disappearance of species over time, and how that relates to the potential causes of change. And finally, I'll say that those of us in the Harvard Geological Survey of Pakistan project who have been working in this area since the 1970s are now working on a synthetic book that summarizes our findings from this period. And this book is in preparation. The title is At the Foot of the Himalayas, Paleontology and Ecosystem Dynamics of the Siwalik Record of Pakistan. And the editors include myself, David Pilbeam, and Michelle Morgan. David and Michelle are both based at Harvard. And we are quite far along in this book and are very excited to be summarizing what we've been working on for so many years. So let's go on to the next slide, please. I don't think. Mukhtar, if I could have slide 3, please.
Isn't that it?
Great, thank you. So this is perfect. Now this photograph is one that I took of much of our field party in 1996 when we were in a field camp near the town of Hasnot in the Potwar Plateau. And here you see some of your Pakistani colleagues, Dr. Imran Khan, Mohammed Anwar, and Khalid Sheikh, and who were all working with us at the time. And then some of the other people I'll point out, here's Kay, whom you're going to hear from later in this series. And I hope that you'll also hear from Michelle Morgan, who's right here on the left. She is also one of the editors of this Siwalik volume that I just mentioned. And I want to start now with picking up on a couple of themes that John Barry mentioned when he talked to us two weeks ago. One of the themes he mentioned was collaboration, and that's very important to me and to all of us who have worked there. And I want to talk about 3 aspects of collaboration. One is that we are collaborating with the rock record itself. It is an eternal source of fascination, and we often feel as though we're literally in conversation with the rocks and the fossils around us. Secondly, we are collaborating with our Pakistani colleagues and hosts, and that has also been extremely valuable to us and literally essential. And finally, we're collaborating with each other. And so I'm often going to refer to what we have accomplished rather than what I have accomplished, because I could not have accomplished anything that I'm going to report on here without the collaboration of many other people. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Next slide, Mukhtar.
Can you see next slide?
Yep. We see the next slide. We see it.
I cannot see the. I don't see the next. I'm still on the
Oh,
group of
it
people
might take
at
a little while,
the field camp.
It's
Yeah.
we see a remarkable record. So Catherin, there's a little bit of a lag, and you'll have to imagine that we are seeing the next slide, even though it hasn't quite gotten to your computer yet.
Okay, fine. Great. Okay, great. Then I'm going to hold on to just a moment so that I can see. I need myself then to see what those various slides are, because oh, here it is. So now I want to talk about how remarkable this record is, the Siwalik record of Pakistan. And there's three different ways in which I'm going to say how remarkable it is. One of them is conveyed in this scene, which is a slide that I took in 1979 of Lewis and Bonnie Jacobs near the Chinji Rest House. And they're standing on a sandstone ledge that we can trace for probably 30 kilometers before we come to the end of the horizon in this view. So one of the remarkable things about the Siwalik record is how extensive it is, both in space and in time. And this is very unusual to have such an enormous expanse of time represented in these sediments, which altogether are more than 3,000 meters thick, at least in this part of the Patwar Plateau. And they are also beautifully exposed over an enormous area. So that's one of the ways in which this record is remarkable. And the next slide, please. The next slide should show you a view of the Camellia Formation, and that's also one of the other remarkable things, is that because of the beautiful exposures, then it's possible for us to study the details of individual formations in their lithologies, in their fossil productivity, in the fossils that come from them, and to compare the lithologies of the formations in one area of the Patwar Plateau with those in another area, and analyze the way the landscape is changing over the enormous area of the Patwar Plateau. So, so here we see the Camellia Formation, which is roughly equally divided between sandstones and mudstones. Let's see, I think there we go. Here's the image back. And that's a very distinctive ratio. And it turns out that it's not quite as fossiliferous as the younger formations, but nonetheless has some very critical occurrences in it, both in terms of the paleoecology of the time as well as the animals that are appearing there. So the next slide, please. The next slide is going to zoom in on this scene to take us to a fossil locality in the Camellia. And what I want to convey through when we get the slide back is that another aspect of the remarkable part of the record is that we can study so many fossil localities in detail, in their lithological details and also in their fossil details, and understand the ways in which the fossils have come to be preserved. So I'm hoping I'll get our slides back in a moment.
The next slide is now on the display.
Yeah,
are other folks seeing the
yep.
slides?
We're seeing people closely looking at the ground.
Okay, I'm just seeing black at the moment. So it's not coming through to me at all for some reason.
So
we see slide 6.
And anyway, what we're seeing here, right, what you're seeing then is, and I'm just going to try to open up my presentation so that I can make sure that I'm following along with you. Okay, so what you're seeing there is simply three people looking for fossils at one of our rich Camellia localities, which turned out to have a remarkable set of interesting animals, and we have about 1,300 localities like this in the Potwar Plateau that we've been studying over the years. So let's go to the next slide, which will be slide 7. Oh,
Yes.
now they're back. Great. And here I want to reiterate another theme that John Barry mentioned. And in the next slide, slide 7, this emphasizes the importance of telling time. And we have devoted months and months of people's time to measuring stratigraphic sections, to sampling these sections for analyzing the magnetic stratigraphy. And by putting all this information together, we're able to create a very detailed record of the chronology of the formation, the Siwalik formations in the Potwar Plateau in all of the different places that we've worked. And this enables us then, and so what you see on the left here is a kind of a summary diagram of the ways in which these major lower and middle Siwalik formations relate to the geomagnetic timescale in the stripes of black and white, and then to geologic time itself on the vertical axis. And then we see the distribution of fossil localities throughout the section. On the right-hand part of this figure, you're seeing a figure from a paper by Kay Berensmeyer and colleagues, showing simply an example of how we take a local section, stratigraphic section, and correlate that to the geomagnetic timescale, enabling us then to tell time very precisely in different parts of the Potwar Plateau. And this provides a foundation for all of the other work that we do. Next slide, please.
We are on next slide. 50 families of mammals.
Okay, fine. Great. And so after all this collecting we have now more than 50,000 catalog specimens. We've shown these specimens to all of a whole range of experts who mostly study fossil vertebrates. Almost all of our fossils are fossil vertebrates from the Potwar Plateau of Pakistan. And over time, then, we've been able to identify more than 300 species of mammals in 50 different families. So a huge ecological and taxonomic diversity. And then when we are able to put that all into a time frame, the way as shown in this diagram, we are now looking at a record extending from almost 18 million years in the lower part of the time scale on the left, on the vertical axis, to 5 million years. And each of these vertical lines represents the duration of a single species that has been identified by a whole series of fossils that occur at different parts of the record. And what the heavy lines represent in this diagram is the observed range based on the occurrences of each species at fossil localities. And then the thin lines extending out from the heavy line represent what the statistical confidence intervals on each stratigraphic range. And you can see that some of these intervals are very long, some are extremely long, some are extremely short. The difference has to do with how well sampled each species is in the fossil record of the Siwaliks. So for those species that have maybe 20 to 50 localities, they have very small confidence intervals. For species represented by just maybe 2 or 3 localities, the confidence interval is very large.
Please mute yourselves. Please mute yourselves.
Thank you, Bob. So let's go on to the next slide, Mukhtiar. Thank you. This next slide, I think I'm seeing you, the previous slide. We want to go forward now to slide 9, please. And slide 9 is essentially the outline of what the main subject of my talk. That is how we go from fossils to ecosystems.
Now
we go from fossils. You're on slide 9 now?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. I'm seeing slide 7 on the screen, but I will see slide 9 presently. So I want to mention 4 different aspects of paleo environmental reconstruction. And one is that we look at the facies characteristics of the sediments themselves. And these are the basis for inferring the environments, the landscape, and the vegetation. Second, we look at the fossils, individual fossils, which convey information about the size and the ecological habits of the original living animals in the landscape. Third, we look at fossil assemblages, which are the animals that occur together at individual localities and in time intervals that we can trace across the landscape through the stratigraphic sequence. And in that way, we analyze which species live together and in which environments they lived and which species lived in different environments with other associations. And then finally, the fourth component of reconstructing paleo environments is looking at changes over time. And of course, since we have a record that is almost 13 million years long, the part that we have studied intensively, we're able to look at changes over time in the number of species, the kinds of species, that is their ecological character, and the environmental changes that were happening around them to try to understand what were the causes of faunal change. So let's go on now. Now, what I'd like to do now is to go into each of these 4 aspects in more detail. So next slide, please. Slide 10. Now, slide 10 is a beautiful draft illustration by Julius Sotogni, who I believe is with us here tonight. And this is a draft based on a locality from the Chinji Formation. And we know exactly how old it is. We know which animals, of course, live there. And if you look at this scene, it's full of details, beautiful details. So we have this luxurious vegetation. We're clearly looking at a scene that's a forest. It's a swampy forest. And there's a big shallow pond here on the lower right that has crocodiles in it and enormous water snakes and turtles, and perhaps a catfish lurking in the muddy water here. And then on land, we have some slightly unfamiliar mammals that are on land, that are terrestrial mammals, including, this is a big Calicathere, which is a relative of rhinos and horses. And then we have some apes over here in the trees. We have some spectacular birds flying through the landscape. Here we have on the left, we have a squirrel that's dashing down a tree trunk holding a flower in its mouth. And then we have a tree shrew over here eating insects. And then lurking in the background is one of our ancient elephant relatives. And then there are a couple of other giant snakes that are wrapped around a branch. So you might say, well, how do we know that it looked like this? And I want to explain by the various ways that we have of reconstructing the environment that all of these details are very carefully chosen based on what we understand of this particular locality. And the only thing for which we had to go outside Pakistan to get the details is the vegetation, because the Siwalik record of Pakistan has very, very, very sparse body fossils of plants. But in fact, the Siwalik record of India and Nepal is full of plant fossils. And so we use the fossils that we know of the fossil plants from those records from that time period to help give us ideas about what was growing in Pakistan as well. So let's look at the next slide then. And in this next slide, we're going to see a scene from a late Miocene locality. Let me know when that's up.
Yes, we are on next slide, slide 11, late Miocene locality.
Great. Okay, so now this is a late Miocene locality. And of course, the scene looks very different. Here we also have lots of animals here, but now most of the trees are gone. We are clearly dealing with a meadow of here we go. Great. We're dealing with a lot of grasses, very few trees on the landscape, and again we're dealing with bodies of water that are now they're drying up. In the foreground we have a carcass that's being chewed on by a couple of hyenas. We have plenty of snakes in this scene as well, although they're not as large. We have a huge crocodile lumbering toward the carcass. It's going to either eat the carcass or the hyenas or both. And then we also have bones on the surface from earlier dead animals. Then in the, let's see, can you zoom out just a little bit? Mukhtiar, I want to point out a couple of other things on the left.
Yes.
And on the left, we have, now the apes have gone. We have actually a monkey carrying her young with her. And then we have in the background, we have a couple of different kinds of horses, as well as two different kinds of elephant relatives. So there's a lot going on here, and all of the details in this image are based on what we know of this locality. So let's go on to the next slide, but I will need them in full screen in the full size, not zoomed in the way this one is. Okay, that's great. Let's go on to slide 12, please.
Yes, now we are on slide 12.
Great, thank you. So now I want to go over the 4 different aspects of paleoenvironmental reconstruction in a little more details to give you an idea of how we actually arrive at these scenes. So here in this photograph, this is a photograph of some of a view of one of our richest fossil locality. And this is a fossil locality that covers a large area, almost a square kilometer. And in this view here, we're seeing sediments representing thin sheets of conglomerate in the lower left. In the middle, we're seeing lenses of sandstone and mudstone that have been mixed together. And then the redder sediments above those are mudstones with ancient soil features. And I've spent many days and many weeks, in fact, working at this locality and have studied these sediments in detail. And we can tell from the details of these lithologies and the post-depositional features, like the soil features, that this locality represents an abandoned channel with both dry banks where terrestrial animals lived and also ponded water. And we have collected more than 3,000 fossils from this locality, and it's got extraordinary diversity of both aquatic vertebrates as well as terrestrial vertebrates, quite remarkable. And so by studying the details of the lithologies, we're able to place this locality into the context of the larger river system that dominated the floodplains of the original Miocene record. Next slide, please.
So now we are
next. We're going to look at on slide 13.
Yes, we are
Perfect.
on slide 13.
Great, thank you. Now at the same locality, we're looking at 2 bones of the foreleg of two mammals. One is the larger bone is from a giraffe. The smaller one is from an antelope, and these are part of an excavation that I worked on with Kay Berensmeyer and others over several years at this very productive locality. And what we can tell from these bones, first of all, we can identify them by the morphology of their features and also their size that let us know that these belong to giraffe and antelope. And then also the length and the width of the bones indicate the body size and the style of movement of these animals. In addition, if we look very closely, we will see some puncture marks. And these indicate that after these animals died, they were chewed on by carnivorous animals. And by looking at these kinds of details for hundreds of bones from this locality, we can determine that this was a long-term site of both where animals lived and also where they died, and very likely concentrated in this area, possibly during a dry season, where it was possible for carnivores to predators to lurk along the riverbanks and kill animals that came there to drink during the dry season. And so these details, the combination of the lithological features and now the features of the fossils themselves, enable us to tell something about not only the ecology of the animals, but also how this fossil site was formed. So the next slide, please.
So now we are on slide 14, functional morphology.
Great, thank you. Yes, and the reason I'm showing this particular picture, which doesn't have any fossils in it, is that here we're looking at the skulls of some living mammals that have different feeding habits. And the reason I'm showing you this is mainly to point out that the teeth of animals that have different sizes and diets look very distinctive. And on that basis, we're able both to identify the animals that they come from and also make very educated guesses about the different feeding habits of these animals back in the Miocene. So we use what we call functional morphology from living species to understand the dietary habits of ancient species, extinct species. Next slide, please. And that will be slide 15, which takes us to fossil assemblages.
Yes, we are on now slide 15.
Great. Okay. So in here, I want to talk about all the different kinds of fossils that occur together in different localities. And in this diagram here, in the graph on the upper left, we're looking at the number of specimens at 2 different localities from the Chinji Formation, which is a middle Miocene formation in the Potwar Plateau. And in the black bars, you see the number of specimens from the locality that happens to be 639, which we know from the sediments was part of a major channel fill toward the top of the channel sequence. And it turns out that this locality is dominated by aquatic vertebrates. We have fishes, turtles, and crocodiles as the primary fossils in this locality. And there are only a few fossils of terrestrial mammals, including some anthracotheres, which are somewhat hippo-like extinct mammals, tragulids, which are somewhat deer-like mammals that were very abundant in our record and are very rare now, and then one antelope. In contrast, then, we have another locality, which was also of a similar age, which is from a floodplain setting, where most of the year, this was a dry land surface. And so these were the places where the terrestrial mammals would be living. And this locality is dominated by terrestrial mammals, including rodents, aardvarks, this is one of our very lucky sites where we have aardvarks, giraffes, antelope, forest pigs, and then one tragulid. So in this case, the diagram at the bottom here is just giving you a drawing of what the ancient landscape would have looked like, with extensive floodplains, very large channels sweeping through, as well as smaller floodplain channels that eventually joined the large channels. And so by studying these fossil assemblages, we're both able to recreate some of the environments of these particular fossil collections, and also we're able to understand which animals were living together in these different environments. So let's go on to the next slide, please.
Now we are on slide 16, fossil assemblages.
Slide 16?
Yes.
So I'm sticking with the same image from before, and great, thank you. Thank you, Mukhtiar. Great. So in order to gain information from these fossil assemblages, what we do is we count up or tally the number and kinds of animals that live in these individual fossil localities, and then we analyze their ecological attributes by looking at the functional morphology of their teeth, their bones, their skulls, or whatever other features we've got. And then we compare the faunal composition among the different environments, the way I described for this particular comparison here. And then finally, we evaluate the changes in the number and kinds of species that we have over time. And so that will bring me to the last part of my survey of paleoenvironments. So let's go on to the next slide, to slide 17.
Yes, now we are on slide 17, change over time.
Great, thank you. And so here I need to give you a little bit of background that comes primarily from the work of Turi Serling and Jay Quaid. And this is the study of stable isotopes in ancient soil formations. And so it turns out our record, not surprisingly, because we're dealing with a huge floodplain system, has many, many soil formations throughout the sequence over many millions of years. And Turi and Jay have sampled the soil carbonates that formed during these soil profiles, and they have analyzed the chemistry of the carbon and oxygen isotopes from these carbonates. And the brown circles in this diagram show you the carbon isotopic values from hundreds and hundreds of samples of soil carbonates extending from 16 million years till almost the present day. And so what we see here is that the carbon values are very negative early in this sequence, between about 16 and about 7 million years ago. And around 7 million years ago, there's a very large shift toward more positive values. And then this shift occurs over a period of about 2 million years. And by around 5 million years ago, then the values that we have in the soils are much more positive. Now, based on what we understand of these carbon isotopes in modern environments, these are signifying a major change in the vegetation that grew on these floodplains. So the more negative values represent forest and mixed woodland, and the more positive values represent grasslands, dominated by a particular kind of grasses that we call C4 grasses. So this is the background against which we now want to analyze the mammal record. And all these green symbols here represent hundreds of mammal teeth that have also been analyzed for carbon isotopes. And we see then that they are following the pattern that we see in the ancient soils very closely. Now let's go on to slide 18.
Yes, now we are on slide 18, change over time in final composition.
Now this is thank you, Mukhtiar. In this slide, we're looking at the same transition in the as in the previous slide, but now we're focusing on 42 mammalian lineages that pass through the later Miocene part of the record, when we experienced the transition from forest to grassland. And that transition is marked off in the light line that outlines a box on the graph from about 8.5 to 6 million years ago. And each one of these vertical lines represents a mammal species and how long it lasted in the record. And we've grouped these species by their feeding habits, and we've reconstructed their feeding habits based on their stable isotopes, based on their general dental morphology, and also on the microwear that we can observe on the chewing surfaces of the teeth. So we have 5 different kinds of mammals represented here in terms of feeding habits. We have fruit eaters, we have leaf eaters, those are the browsers. We have a couple of omnivores. We have the mixed feeders, eat a combination of grass and leaves, broad leaves. And then finally, we have the grazers over on the right. And what we see then through this period of transition from forest to grassland is that the fruit eaters gradually die out, and then the fruit eaters die out, and then the browsers, the leaf eaters, die out a little bit later. We see that the animals that ate a combination of broadleaves and grass persisted they came and went, but they didn't all disappear. And then we see that the grass eaters persisted through, a couple of them persisted right through this interval. So over the entire interval, we are seeing a huge change in the composition of the mammals that lived on the Potwar Plateau back when it was very much like the Ganges ecosystem. And we also see then that the feeding habits of the mammals that were able to survive this transition have changed very substantially from those that were primarily eating fruit and leaves in forest, to those that were eating leaves and grass out in woodlands, to those that are eating grass and grasslands. And so the colors in each of these vertical lines represent the carbon isotope scale over here on the right. So those colors that are dark blue and dark green represent animals that have very negative values and that we're eating in forests, and those that are yellow and orange represent those that we're eating in much more open habitats. And so here we're able to focus in on the feeding ecology of these mammals to understand the ways in which the change in vegetation affected them. And we do think that this entire change was driven by regional changes in climate that caused the shift from forest to grassland vegetation in this region. And this record of climate change influencing the vegetation and then ultimately the mammals holds lessons for us about climate change today as well. Because we're seeing the fossil record is showing us that when we get substantial changes in climate, that we're getting very major changes to the ecosystems in all parts of the planet. And so we can use the fossil records to give us an idea of the kinds of changes that will be happening on Earth in our lifetimes and in our children's lifetimes over the next 100 years. So let's go on to the next slide, please. And the next slide should back to the scenes that I showed you a little while ago. Slide 19 is Julius's depiction of this middle Miocene locality with this luxurious forest that is teeming with life. And then let's go on to the next slide, please. Slide 20 should take us to our late Miocene locality, also teeming with life, but with life that looks quite different. Life in the dry season, when water is drying up, when times are a little bit harder, and when many different animals are competing to get that last bit of water and are finding that things are pretty crowded around the watering hole, and there are some hungry predators ready to gobble up some of the animals, the herd animals that are lurking in the distance. And so I hope that by telling you about the 4 different aspects of paleoenvironmental reconstruction, that you can understand some of the ways by which we arrive at these scenes, with all of these details very carefully chosen to represent the kind of information that we have assembled over many years of study in the Siwalik record. Let's go on to the next slide, and then I think this is my last slide.
Yes, we are in summary now.
Very good, thank you. So in conclusion then, let me say that once again, that the Siwalik record of Pakistan is a remarkable record, exceptionally long and continuous record of ecosystem change, making it of tremendous value for paleontologists like those in our group, paleontologists and geologists in our group. So because we can study over millions of years, over a huge area, the ecosystems of the past and try to test ideas about the causes of their change. And then the field of paleoecology, which is my specialty, utilizes the information from sediments, fossils, and fossil assemblages to reconstruct these ancient environments and to evaluate causes of change. And so what we've learned over our many years, that the Siwalik record is documenting a major change in climate in South Asia, and that affected the vegetation and the mammal diversity in the late Miocene, when forest ecosystems changed to monsoonal grasslands. And this record is so remarkable that it is now well known to paleontologists and geologists all over the world for the kinds of insights that we and others have been able to develop in ways that I've described this evening. And so I hope that particularly those of you in Pakistan will realize that you have an absolute treasure in this record. And my final comment, harking back to what John Barry talked about when he spoke 2 weeks ago, is when asked, would he have anything to do if he could come back here? And I would echo what he said. Absolutely. If I would love to come back to work in this record, and I have a long list of tasks that I would start working on immediately, because even though we have worked now, many of us, probably a couple hundred of us, have worked in this area now over 4 decades. We have discovered, as much as we have discovered, we've also discovered how much we don't know and would like to keep working on. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherin. Magnificent variety of approaches to understanding sort of ancient landscapes through time. I think we're all becoming, I'm going to put the word paleogeomorphology out there, but we're looking at the changing of the landscapes through time and the denizens or the creatures that lived on those landscapes. And I'd like to maybe pose a question, just a general one, about the large scale changes in rock patterns or lithologies or facies. As you look at the Siwalik record, one of the characteristics is the sandstone to shale ratio. You mentioned it briefly. And does your team, or do you feel like there are commensurate changes in the character of the river systems through time in terms of like, for example, the Chinji to Nagri transition? I'm asking about those large scale facies changes.
Right. That's a great question. And the answer is yes. Certainly the ratios themselves are probably not the main feature that tells us about the river systems, although they're certainly part of it. But what the work of John Bridge and Brian Willis and additional students of John Bridge have looked in detail at what is called the alluvial architecture, particularly of the channels. And they're able to study the size of the channels, the size of the bed forms. And by doing that, and in combination with the thickness of the units, they're able to reconstruct literally how vast across the landscape these channels were. And we do see big changes in channel width and also lithological composition over time. So, and the other thing is we also see some changes in the character of the mudstones and of the fossil soils. And so and Kay Behrensmeyer and Turi Serling have especially worked on that aspect of the record. And so both of those, the studies of both of those major lithologies have given us major insights into the changes in river systems. So we have I think the conclusion of Brian Willis and John Bridge's other students is that most of the channels that we're looking at in the Potwar Plateau are on the scale of the Jhelum River at their largest, not quite on the scale of the Indus, which suggests that the Indus, or the Proto-Indus or Proto-Ganges, whichever it was at the time, is preserved somewhere else in the Foreland Basin. We're not looking at channels that are quite that large, but we do see quite at all times a hierarchy of large channels with smaller channels, most of the smaller channels mainly weaving across the floodplain, either as tributaries or what are called distributaries when the flood is in season and the water is flowing out of the channel and out onto the floodplain. And so, and there's, I'm hoping that if Kay gets a chance to give a talk in this series, she'll be able to illuminate this topic further, because she's done some wonderful work looking at studying essentially tracing out these channels and soils across the landscape, so that we get a sense of what it would be like to go for a long walk on the Miocene landscape.
No, thank you very much, Catherin. And we will have a talk by Kay and also a talk by Turi Serling coming up later on in the series. So we'll be hearing.
We have a couple of questions.
Yeah. Let me turn it over to you if you can pull the questions out of the chat.
Yeah. So the question is from Dr. Samina from Center. So you can ask question.
Yes, please.
Hi, good morning, and assalamu alaikum to all of you. It was, Catherin, it was a very interesting and very informative talk, and I suppose that an hour is very limited time to squeeze all those information and your hard work which you have conducted in Siwalik. My question is regarding the ancient soil and reconstruction of paleocarbonate to the paleo-environment and climatic. Do you have any research publications so that I can go through them?
Oh, yes, we do. Many. And there, I would say the publications to look for are those by Turi Serling and Jay Quaid. And Bob, maybe you can let us know. I know you have your Siwalik stratigraphy website. Do you have any of their publications on that website?
I'd have to quickly check, but we are making a big effort, Samina, to get literature onto the website so that it's pretty easy to download. And let me maybe work with Catherin and others to make sure that we do get those articles that relate to the soil carbonates into that list. We'll take that as a task to do.
Yeah. In the meantime,
Great.
I think Catherin can share the manuscripts with the members so that people would like to go through it before it is available on the website, which is developed by Bob.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to do that on Microsoft Teams. I don't know how to send everybody here a paper.
You just can email. I think that's it. Yeah.
We have another question from Andrew. You can ask question, please, and unmute your mic.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Catherin, for a really interesting talk. Are there any other paleo-ecological or paleo-environmental shifts that are as large as the one that you see between 8 and 6 million years, particularly in the younger part of the record?
That's a good question, and I will probably have to say that I don't know, because we have not worked in that younger part of the record. And there is, I know from other published literature there are gradual changes in the mammal faunas, as we do see a big drop in diversity that is the total number of species in the late Miocene that never fully recovers to what it was before. But we also continue to see quite a change in faunal composition, but it's not quite as concentrated in a narrow interval, and we don't have the associated vegetation change going with it. The vegetation, once it shifts to the grasslands, it stays in that format right up to the present time. And so I've wondered, where are the modern analogs for those systems? And I suspect that the monsoonal grasslands of eastern India are what we're looking at for the late Miocene and even Pliocene parts of the record. And then earlier in the record, there are plenty of changes, and many of them are quite significant, whether they're the immigration of new groups. For example, at around 11 million years, the horses first appear, and that's a big, that makes a big splash in our fossil localities. We get some major shifts in the small mammals, major decline in the group of hamsters and their relatives, and a major increase in the mice and their relatives. But they're not accompanied by the same kind of vegetation shift, at least not to the degree that we're able to tell. One thing I wouldn't, but your question has reminded me that one thing I should mention as an astonishing part of this record, at least through the Miocene portion, is that at all times, from the very beginning, right up to 5 million years ago, there are anywhere from half a dozen to 15 species of mammals that weighed about 1,000 kilograms walking around on the landscape. These are the animals we call the mega herbivores. The only living mega herbivores are the living elephants, the giraffe, and the rhinos, the large rhinos. And there used to be many more species of this kind that have gradually declined, become extinct. But it's quite remarkable to think that many species of large mammals were living on this landscape all together. There must have been an enormous amount of vegetation to keep them all going.
If I could just ask a follow-up question, what do you think was unique about the environment that allowed for preservation of so many mammal fossils, but essentially no plant fossils?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably that it was too heavily oxidized for that rather labile organic material to persist. And although I have not been able to visit the Siwalik sequences of India or Nepal, from what I've read about them, they sound as though it would seem that those sequences are have much stronger reducing environments. In other words, there may have been much more swampy, ponded water much of the time, whereas in our sequence, once we get out from the channels, we have either channels that are usually pretty well sorted sandstone, so they drain water well, and the floodplains, which have plenty of mud, lots of clay, and would, in principle, be able to hold on to a lot of water, they are very heavily oxidized. And so that kind of setting will destroy plant material quite quickly, regrettably. Other questions? Are there questions from students in the audience? I would love to have a question from students.
I think there's no questions.
So I'll just chime in. This is Bob, and I'll just say one of the interesting things as I listen to the work that Catherine's reporting on and John reported on earlier, and it's fascinating to sort of compare the Miocene Siwalik record with I'll say the Pleistocene, or the very youngest part, and huge amounts of work have been done in both realms, and the realm of the Miocene that Catherin has reported on is a realm in which there's marvelous revelations about paleoecology and landscape. And then the younger record, and I'm just speaking sort of from my own perspective, but the younger record is so involved with the ongoing deformation associated with the evolution of the foothills of the Himalayas, and it's almost as if there's sort of a two-sided story here, and the work that's been reported on by the Yale and Harvard and GSP teams has worked on these paleo landscapes, and a lot of the work that the Dartmouth team and Peshawar University faculty and students worked on was focused on the evolution of the geomorphology at a large scale, the development of the foothills of the Himalayas. And I think that we'll hear a little bit more about that. We've got several structural geology talks coming, and I think Doug Burbank will probably comment on the interplay between tectonics and sedimentation. So one of the fascinating stories at a very large scale here is that the Siwalik record, with all of its continuous story, has this has this full system of both paleo landscape evolution and then really paleo topographic evolution associated with the encroachment of the foothills onto the same landscape.
That's very interesting, Bob. Yeah, one of the early studies by our group, primarily led by Kay Berensmeyer and Lisa Tokes, was an analysis in the Doak-Patan Formation, late Miocene, of two interfingering river systems, one dominated by very large channels with a distinctive lithology and petrology, and one of them by much smaller channels with another distinctive lithology and petrology. And they concluded that the larger channels were major trunk channels that were draining right out of the big mountain ranges, whereas the big mountain range, the Himalayas themselves, whereas the smaller channels were draining the foothills. And those channels had a lot more mud in them, and they were much smaller, much more in fine networks crisscrossing the floodplain. And most of the fossil localities were associated with that network of smaller channels, implying that that's where the animals were living. And they weren't associated with the much bigger channels, which must have had massive floods during the flood season, and they might have been good places to visit, but not places that terrestrial animals could live very long.
We have a question.
Anyway, that's a wonderful study, and you'll want to make sure that you get that on the website. Sorry, Kiara, please.
We have a question from Julius. Please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Please.
Oh, hi, Catherin. Wonderful talk. Thank you. Thank
you. Thanks for coming, Julius.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, it's always nice to see you. You guys expand more on this fascinating research. And I'm curious. Can you say anything about how much you expect fire to have modified the landscape, especially as it may have changed during climate change events there?
Yeah, great question. And actually very timely too, because there's been some fairly recent work on what are called biomarkers, which are very small, essentially chemical particles that are preserved in the fossil sediments, in the ancient sediments, that are, these are very organic compounds that are very resistant to degradation. And some of them are produced during hot fires. And what that shows in our record is that there was very little in the way of fire during the early and middle Miocene part of the record. But then in the later Miocene, these indicators of fire frequency and intensity increase, suggesting that as the grasslands spread out on the floodplains, that fire became a very regular part of the ecosystem. Now, how that's going? Now, that's not surprising for grasslands. In many grasslands of the world today, if the fire is not too controlled by people, it's a very regular part of the ecology of those systems. And it has, although we often think of fires as having negative effects, they also have ecologically beneficial effects, because they burn a certain amount of vegetation and they immediately release those nutrients right back into the system. So they're typically followed by a flush of very nutritious growth, which benefits, all the animals that live there. And so we do think that fire became an important part of the ecosystem, mainly in the late Miocene.
Interesting. Just one quick follow-up on that, if that's all right. Especially with the mega herbivores, would you expect their trampling effect to have enhanced or even decreased the amount that the landscape would have been susceptible to fire? In other words, by tipping over small trees and such and potentially increasing the amount of fuel, or would that even have been a significant effect?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Julius. I'm thinking about how to answer that, because I'm not sure I've really thought about that one before. I'm thinking about the mega herbivores that were there all the time. And one thing that they do, at least judging from the way modern elephants behave, is they push over a lot of trees. So I imagine that would have happened throughout the entire sequence, whether we were dealing with a forest or a grassland. But what that might have done for fires might have I'm not sure it would have made a big difference to fires as long as forests were dominating the landscape. But as the forest shrank and the canopy opened up, I suspect that those dead trees on the landscape made for larger fires, and that the whether the trampling would suppress those or enhance them, I'm not sure. But I think the mega herbivores would have had a very positive effect on the fires.
Thank you.
So we have Doug Burbank for his comment, please.
I'm interested in the description you gave of the faunal and environmental changes that were happening from sort of the Nagri-Dokpatan transition and such, and suggesting that it's, I don't know, maybe not unique, but unusually well defined and uncommon in the record. And I'm wondering how the magnitude of the climate change, for example, compared to what we see during the Pleistocene going from glacial to interglacial connections and back at 100,000 year or even 40,000 year timescales, and is part of the contrast because the record in the Siwaliks, even at the best resolution, probably it's very rare that you could get to 100,000 years with confidence, and certainly in successive layers. Is it that it's so smeared out that you couldn't see these sorts of things? Or is the Pleistocene so rapid that it doesn't record it in the way that you see it in that environment?
Well, that's a good question. I can't say very much from my own experience about the Pleistocene part of the record. So I'm not sure whether it's recording the 100,000 year or 40,000 year glacial interglacial cycles. We have speculated about whether or not any Milankovitch cycles would be represented in our older sequences, and wondered, for example, whether the regular, what seems often like almost a cyclic alternation of sandstones and mudstones might be responding to some kind of climate cycle. It's hard for us to calibrate it that finely, the way that we don't have the same precision that the deep sea record has in that regard. But I guess I'll also say that the glacial intercycles are strongly dominated by changes in temperature, the temperature budget of the world, and the seasonal. It's actually the seasonal variation in that temperature budget, whereas the change that we're seeing in the late Miocene is primarily driven by precipitation. And we don't yet, we have our oxygen isotopes, and I didn't present the data for the oxygen isotopes, but they're well presented and discussed in the papers by Turi Serling and Jay Quaid. They signify a change in the moisture regime across the Potwar Plateau and possibly across the entire Indian subcontinent. And they are, and then sampling that we've done, what we call serial sampling of some of the tall mammal teeth, have enabled us to see the seasonal variation in oxygen isotopes within the ecosystem, suggesting that there becomes stronger, that there's not only a decline in precipitation across the late Miocene and annual precipitation, but also that coupled with strong seasonal variation in precipitation, and that is, we think, the major driver behind the ecosystem changes that we're seeing. So somewhat different in character from the glacial interglacial cycles, which would be, although in the subtropics, we're not going to get quite the same temperature change as would at higher latitudes, but nonetheless, those would manifest, at least in part, in temperature changes, even I think within the Indian subcontinent.
Okay, I think we have to recognize that Catherin has kindly made this presentation in the middle of the night, and you can see the darkness behind her. It's well beyond midnight where Catherin is located. And so I think what we'd like to do is thank you ever so much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much, Catherin.
Magnificently illustrated with the slides, and thank you, Mukhtar, for sort of patching in with the technology here. And I'd like to join us all with sort of clapping of the hands. I don't know how to do that on the internet, but Catherin, you can hear us all clapping. And I'm just going to invite again to come next week. Hamad Khani is giving a talk on structural geology, and then the following presentation 2 weeks from now will be Doug Burbank, and 3 weeks from now we'll have Muhammad Akbar Khan from Lahore, a paleontologist. So we're going to have some structural geology talks, and then we'll have a paleontology talk, and then we'll march on into the month of April. But again, I just want to thank all of you for participating across the country, across the world, and thank everybody who's been involved with helping the technology come together tonight, and a special thanks to Catherin for her beautiful presentation. Thank you all very much.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And Bob, thank you very much for organizing this. It's a treat for all of us.
Well, it takes a village, and we're all pleased to be in the village. So thank you all, and thank the GSP, and, the